Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Everyone seems to still be coming in, but I will just briefly introduce the webinar and taking some time to introduce the presenters that are here with me. I'm Barbara Rosen-Jacobson, Advocacy Advisor at Mercy Corps and the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. And today we will be discussing a report that was recently published by ODI and the Zurich Alliance, A Fair Share of Climate Finance, it's called, which tracks the climate finance commitments by developed countries and compares it to what they should be paying, their fair share, of the 100 billion climate finance goal. The report, as you, I think, can all agree, is published at a really critical time. We are all witnessing the horrific and devastating floods in Pakistan, along with many other extreme weather events happening all over the world. So the need for climate finance has never been clearer, starting with the $100 billion goal, and yet we are far from reaching the levels of finance needed for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So during this webinar, we will first hear from Sarah Collenbrander and Letizia Pettinotti from ODI. They will be giving a short presentation of the main findings of the report. And following their presentation, we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And please post your questions in the chat during the presentation so that we can have a smooth transition towards the Q&A. And after the Q&A, we will be discussing the report with 3 experts that are here with us. So first we will hear from Karina Bachoven. And while the report discusses mostly where finance is and should be coming from, Karina will discuss where climate finance should be going and the need for climate finance for the most vulnerable, as well as the humanitarian climate nexus that is so important. We will then hear from Maureen Otieno. She's based in Kenya, and she will discuss the challenges of tracking climate finance, especially at more local levels. And finally, we have Cristina Perez here. She's based in El Salvador, and she will provide examples of what happens with climate finance at the local level and provide examples of our work in El Salvador. All speakers know this, but I will reiterate that they should not go beyond their allotted time slots because we have very limited time. But to facilitate the discussion, we would like to ask you to already start using the chat to put your questions. The Q&A will be facilitated by Andrew Duty from Mercy Corps and the Zurich Alliance. And any questions that we will not be able to answer during today's webinar, we will try to reply to them after the webinar. So without further ado, over to you, Sarah and Letizia.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you all so much for joining today. It's a really important issue, and it's really great to see so many people are concerned about the inequities in the provision of climate finance, as well as the inequities in its receipt. And we really hope that this work will be useful for you. My name is Sarah Collenbrander, and I lead the Climate and Sustainability Program at ODI. We also have from ODI Letizia Pettinotti, who's a Senior Research Officer and environmental economist who played a pivotal role in authoring this paper. The first things I want to say, in addition to thanking you all for joining today, is to say a big thanks to the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance for your support, both in terms of the content and in terms of helping it to reach this critical audience. We couldn't have done it without you. So thank you very much for working with us on this exciting piece. So Letizia and I are going to go into some really nerdy stuff about how we weighted different indicators and how we dug data out of the depths of the OECD and so on. But I thought it would be helpful to start off by providing a bit of context about the climate finance landscape as it stands. Many of you will know this, and apologies if it's repetitive. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I hope it's helpful. So the UN climate accords were formed in the early 1990s, and at that point there were two main categories of countries. Annex 1 countries, which were industrialized countries from the OECD, or economies in transition, for basically the former USSR. And then there were the non-Annex 1 countries, which was everyone else. And those two categories had underpinned the climate accords for basically the next 20 years. And even to this day, they remain the kind of primary lists of developed and developing countries. And that's a problem because the world has changed a lot since 1990. It might not feel like it now that we've got the inflation of the 70s and Putin trying to expand the reach of Russia once again. But nonetheless, the major difference is, of course, that we've seen tremendous economic and human development in large parts of the world, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. And consequently, we've seen significantly increasing emissions and consequently rising responsibility for climate change. This led to a situation in the mid-2000s where developed countries or Annex I countries that were required to reduce their emissions under the early climate accords were frustrated that emerging economies were coming up and emitting without similar constraints. Basically, there was an exporting of pollution. And the deal that was struck to get developing countries to come to the table and start taking on responsibilities for climate mitigation was an increased provision of climate finance from rich countries to poorer countries or middle-income countries to enable them with that transition. And that was the 100 billion goal agreed in the Copenhagen Accords that you heard so much about in the lead up to COP26. You heard so much about it because although agreed in 2009, that 100 billion goal was only meant to be achieved year on year from 2020. And COP26 was the first COP after that deadline, and developed countries had failed to mobilize that 100 billion. They got to around 80 billion in 2020 and again in 2021. Understandably, with a decade of notice, developing countries were very unimpressed with this outcome. The point of our paper is firstly to say that not all developed countries have equally failed on this. Some have delivered their fair share of climate finance, and it's important to call out the laggards instead, rather than reviving this rich versus poor dialogue. The second point of our paper is to look at which countries in the last 30 years have now become rich enough and polluting enough that they should also become accountable for climate finance. And so it's in that spirit that the research has been published. I am just going to share my screen if my computer will allow me to do so. I'm about to hand over to Letitia to talk through our methodology and results. But firstly, let me just really clarify what we're talking about when we talk about climate finance in this context. The aspiration is that all financial flows, public, private, international, domestic, should be aligned with the Paris Agreement. In practice, in 2021, about 630 billion, a tiny fraction of the world economy, was spent in a dedicated climate-oriented way. The 100 billion target is a small fraction, of course, of that, and it speaks particularly to the money provided and mobilized by developed countries for developing countries each year. As I said before, only 80 billion of that was successfully mobilized or provided, and of that, less than half, as of 2020, went to adaptation. So we are talking in particular about the 100 billion or 80 billion, not all financial flows, but this specific niche of developed countries' responsibility for developing countries in this context. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Letitia.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and hi, everyone. So as Sarah was saying, this is the context that our study comes into. So there has been this collective failure from developed countries. 200 billion a year by 2020. And the wording of the target was always loose. So there is a lot of ill-defined elements, like who are these developing countries, etc. But really what we thought would be key to the negotiations around renewing this goal that are underway at the moment at the UNFCCC but for 2025 is that the wording is that developed countries should jointly provide climate finance. And so it's really difficult to hold accountable a collective bunch of developed countries. It's a bit of a diffuse responsibility, and that leads to a lack of accountability. And so this is what our analysis is about apportioning responsibility to each developed country that we have understood to be Annex II countries, so that we can apportion responsibility and then hold each country individually accountable as per the benchmark of the fair share. So this is the fair share methodology. Basically, it's about having an individual country benchmark so that we can hold them accountable. So we have done a fair share of climate finance, and a fair share of international public finance, which is official development assistance, as you see. So for the official development assistance, the benchmark has already been agreed, is 0.7% of GNI for OECD DAC countries. So we didn't have to come up with a benchmark. But as Sarah was explaining, very loose wording as to the target agreed in 2009. So what should be the fair share when it comes to climate finance? So we have come together to produce an indicator. Well, actually, a composite indicator, because we use 3 proxies that we felt, but this is obviously like something that's up for debate and not prescriptive in any way, because we understand this is the core of negotiations. But we wanted to represent the fair share as an ability to pay from developed countries, their historical responsibility in our changed climate, and also consider a per capita element to the GNI and to cumulative emissions, because we want to recognize there is a human resource aspect, so that it's not an aggregate, but relative to the population. So next slide. So we have, thank you. So this is a league table that we came up with for 2017 up until 2020. So on the left-hand side columns, this is the absolute value that each country should contribute towards the 100 billion goal. And here we have assessed them in terms of, actual climate finance provided, and then so in terms of percentage, how much are they progressing towards what should be their fair share of the 100 billion goal? So top of the leagues, we have the amazing Sweden, France, Norway, Japan, Netherlands, Germany, who all have provided their fair share of the 100 billion in 2020. We do recognize this is a quantitative assessment in terms of quality. There are differences. So for example, Japan and France provide more loans than grants. So this they may be providing their fair share quantitatively, but qualitatively, for example, it means that because they provide loans, it increases indebtedness of developing countries. So there is this question again that surfaces of equity that is really at the core of this research. And then at the bottom of our league table, there is the US, there is Australia, and I guess next slide, please. This is really where our analysis is useful. So the US, we have estimated, should provide 43 billion out of the 100 billion. And so where our analysis really comes in handy is to understand when Biden makes an announcement of we're going to double our climate finance. Of course, it's welcome. However, what does it mean? Is it enough? Is it not? And so this is why we say, well, actually, doubling climate finance only means the US is contributing 10% of what it should contribute towards 100 billion. And when we put it in perspective, compared to the economy of Japan, Germany, the UK, this is really shameful when it comes to what the US should contribute. Next slide, please. And the same. In absolute value, of course, the US is responsible for the major share of the shortfall towards 100 billion, but Australia and Canada are also contributing to this failure. And again, this is why our analysis comes in like really useful to hold governments accountable, saying, right, you say you could provide this much, but actually, is it fair? And next slide, please. It also allows us to put in perspective and benchmark each country, not only against one same benchmark as to, is this fair towards the collective goal, but also between countries. So, okay, the US is providing X amount, and that's 5% of its fair share. But in terms of emissions, so it's responsible for 50% of all developed countries' emission, compared to the EU, is providing 12 times less. So this is why our analysis, of course, I'm biased, but we hope really will help in terms of campaigning. And I'll let Sarah take over again and to give us, well, the view as to the future. So up to 2025, what is it looking like? Are we failing against? Thank you. Oh, this PowerPoint is gone though, Sarah. I don't know if that was meant.
It was not meant, but it will come back in a second. Apologies to everyone. I was trying to check the time to make sure we were on track, and I think we have 2 minutes more. So thank you very much, Letitia. Let me say, as an Australian, that I'm also biased. I think we're awful and could do much better. So just to add that in addition to Letitia's points, we also looked forward. A big feature of COP26 was developed countries pledging to do better. And as Letitia said, it was quite hard to assess how much better they were in fact doing. The headline message here is really simple. Mostly the countries that were doing well continue to do well. Where there seems to be a slight deviation, you'll see that Germany and Denmark seem to be falling short very narrowly of their fair share. We think that's a function of the nature of the announcement. So Germany's announcement, for example, did not include the work by KfW, its development bank, which would bring it over the edge there. A few countries are notable for making a real step change in the level of their climate finance commitments. I know we've got a few people from the UK and Ireland on the call. It was great to see higher commitments from both those countries alongside Spain and New Zealand. Italy did step up, but it didn't step up very much and was from a pretty low base, so it needs to be commented on separately. Once again, the three villains are still the three Anglo-settler colonies of Australia, Canada, and the US, who are all extremely polluting and extremely reluctant to pay their fair share of climate finance. Here's hoping that changes with the new Australian government. The second piece that we wanted, actually, I'm going to skip this bit for time, but happy to talk about it at any point. That was just an assessment of how climate finance compared with overseas development assistance, official development assistance, all in the report. Recommend you read it. Great fun, real page turner. The other piece that I really want to draw your attention to at the end here is this story of who else should be providing climate finance. And once again, Letitia and I and our colleague Yue put together a couple of metrics in the absence of any official basis for becoming a climate finance contributor within the climate accords. We put forward two options: per capita GDP, or per capita income, which is our metric for a country's capacity to pay, and per capita historical emissions, which has always been the basic argument under which industrialized countries should be providing climate finance. And what you'll see on this figure here is that only a handful of countries really qualify under both of those. Particularly Singapore, Qatar, and Israel stand out. Those three countries, Singapore and Qatar, both have a per capita income and per capita historical emissions that are higher than over half of the countries that are currently obliged to provide climate finance. Israel has similarly high level of emissions, higher than half of the countries providing climate finance, though its ability to pay is slightly lower, and it's higher than 5 countries that are obliged to provide climate finance. A few candidates that are very polluting but not as wealthy would include some Middle Eastern candidates, Kuwait, UAE, also Brunei, all oil producers, and then South Korea, which has obviously seen very tremendous, actually, economic development in the last few years. I think a really striking thing is the suite of countries that don't qualify on the basis of income, but are very polluting historically. We have 3 main categories: former USSR members, given a very large base of heavy industry in the non-Russian members and a coal-based power system. We have a lot of oil exporters where fossil fuels tend to be cheap, and therefore there's no incentives to use it efficiently. And small island developing states, which due to geography often have very carbon-intensive power systems, and until renewables became cost-effective, they weren't viable. And so the question is how you pivot and ask some of these countries, which have historically not considered themselves developed and consider themselves, if anything, entitled to receive climate finance, how you start to shift that narrative to recognize this middle ground for countries. The last point I want to make on this is just the very striking fact that the conversation about climate finance very often focuses on China and how China, which is a major provider of aid, should become a climate finance contributor. You'll see that China doesn't appear on this graph at all. It's just not rich enough and not historically dirty enough per person to qualify under our proposed metric. So we really hope that that will enable a more constructive debate in the next couple of rounds of negotiations in terms of expanding the contributor base. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. Handing back to you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Letitia, and it's really, really interesting and really necessary. And I encourage everyone here who hasn't already read the report to read it, because indeed it is really interesting and it is a page turner. So we have one question in the chat from Danielle. Danielle, would you like to ask the question here, or I also see that Letitia already provided a response, but we can go deeper into it. And for the others, I encourage you to lift your hand in case you would like to ask a question. We have about 10 minutes for the question and answer, and we will share the link to the report in the chat.
Thanks, Barbara. I also have a few questions that were submitted ahead of time, possibly by people who weren't able to make it, but interested in the issue and who might want to catch up on the recording. So one of the questions is about the polluter pays principle, which sounds like the report has quite a lot of alignment with. So I was wondering if you could, for the benefit of the person who asked the question, just to clarify what that is and whether or not you consider it valid, based on what you've discovered in this report.
Shall I jump in, Letitia? So the polluter pays principle is a fantastic one, and it's a fundamental principle underpinning a lot of ecological and environmental economics. It's the idea that whichever individual or company or country was responsible for pollution should also bear the cost of remediation, of sorting out the problem, and of compensation if necessary. That has been a big theme throughout the climate negotiations, and it's a big theme of our report as well. I think our use of the emissions per capita and national emissions as one of the benchmarks for identifying new contributors and for weighting which countries should pay more climate finance within the established group of contributors both reflect the polluter pays principle. I think it's really important to recognise that not many people appreciate how varied the carbon intensity of economic development can be. So countries with relatively comparable levels of income, let us say France and the US, have wildly different levels of carbon emissions. France is about 4 tons of carbon per person per year, and the US, last time I checked, was at about 18. And that reflects the composition of the electricity grid. It reflects the dependence on cars to get around as opposed to mass transit or active transport, and a whole bunch of other factors. And so countries should be rewarded in the climate finance architecture for pursuing a cleaner path, and we try to make that case.
Great, thank you very much. And the report, another question we've had is that the report, goes into some fantastic detail about, creating a framework for accountability. What is the next step here? What can be done to encourage those who are falling behind, especially if it's quite drastically like US, Australia?
I personally have not had a huge amount of success in influencing Australia's climate finance policy, so I'm probably not the right person to be asking about that. I think that the panelists who are speaking next are going to be addressing that in more detail, partially because some of them, like Karina, are already using our results to engage with governments. Are you happy for me to leave that one for the panel, Karina, or do you want me to take a stab?
That's fine. Andrew, you can just come back to it and remind me.
Yes, of course. But just for everyone as well, we will have time for a Q&A after the other panelists speak, at which point, we'll have extra context for the finding of the report. I did see a hand go up there, but I think it's come back down again. So if anyone did want to ask a question, and I'll put that to the floor, there is still a few minutes we have for asking a couple more questions before we move on. And is not reappearing. Never mind.
As people gather their thoughts, I put a link to another report that spoke to the link between the polluter pay principle and equity in climate finance. Please read it. Again, another page turner, but I see Paul has a question. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you. The one thing I've noticed is that China as a country is emitting more than twice as much as the US. Even though per capita it's going to be lower, and China with its Belt and Road Initiative is at one time they were planning on building 300 coal plants in developing countries to help them with their energy. So it would seem to me that there should be something something about what China is up to rather than just give them a pass because they have a bigger population for their footprint. And I'm just wondering, what do you guys think could be done to get China to help out?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. This is my favorite question. Unless, Letitia, was that a hand up because you wanted to answer it?
I can give some methodological detail explaining exactly, because you seem to be questioning, in terms of per capita, etc. And then Sarah, if you can complete. I just wanted to say that we are looking at cumulative emissions since 1990. And so that's why even if currently maybe China is emitting more, we're taking the long-term perspective because we want to really think through the historical responsibility. Sarah, please go ahead.
Thanks, Letitia. So I think it's really useful to have some numbers to hand for this. So the US accounts, so the first point that Letitia was making is that emissions released over the last 100 years continue to have an impact on the level of warming today. This is not an annual thing that the emissions tomorrow will determine. If we stopped emitting right now, we would continue to have temperatures increase as a legacy for years, if not decades to come, as a result of past emissions. So in that context, it's really useful to understand how countries' historical emissions compare. The US accounts for 4% of the global population, and it accounts for 25% of global emissions. China accounts for about 17% of the world's population, and it accounts for 12% of historical emissions. So if we enter with a basic assumption of equity, the US has grossly abused the global commons, and it has done so for a long time. Once it had already achieved a level of high income status, and it has not chosen to make changes in response to the scientific data in the way that comparably high emitters at the point of 1990 have chosen to do so, such as the UK and Germany. And for that reason, the US should be on the hook for climate finance. It chooses not to be. And for that reason, we need extra accountability for that. I think the second thing to say is that if we want to think about, I think it's worth thinking more holistically around the two countries' respective roles in the global coal and clean energy transitions. You're absolutely right. China has continued to finance coal at scale, and that is a problem, and it's recently committed not to do so, but it committed to do so far too late. A lot of people say that, but they never mention that China is the world's biggest producer of solar power, biggest producer of wind turbines, biggest producer of electric vehicles, over half of the global market for electric cars, and 99% of the market for electric buses and electric two-wheelers is in China. And no one mentions that. China, I believe the data is from 2019, but there was a year where China installed more solar than the rest of the world combined. And yet we only hear about its coal because it's convenient. In the same way that with the COPs, we heard a commitment to phase out coal because coal is demanded in China and India, and we heard nothing about oil and gas as part of the Glasgow Climate Pact. And that's because the US is the world's largest producer of oil and gas. So China is not a good guy on climate, but it's not the worst guy. The worst guy is the US, possibly with Australia and Saudi Arabia hanging around near it. And you can hear my accent, so you know that I'm not delighted by this either. But I think any conversation about equity should recognize that China should be the biggest polluter because it's got the biggest population. And the fact that the US is second by a relatively close margin is more damning of the US than it is of China. Thank you for asking my favorite question. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, that was a fantastically detailed answer as well. Thanks very much for that, Sarah. I think we'll have to move on from questions about this specific part of the presentation now. We do still want to hear your questions. If anyone has any that they would like an answer to, please just drop them in the chat. We will get to them at some point. We can follow up with you at a later date. But thank you very much for that, Sarah, and I'll pass it back to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Sarah and Letitia, for replying to the questions. So we will now move on to a panel of experts that we asked to provide some comments on the report, but more importantly, to provide some additional elements that are interesting in kind of understanding and conceptualizing and contextualizing the report. So we will next hear from Karina. She works at the Red Cross Climate Center, and we've had this big picture from ODI, and we would like now to move the conversation to what needs to be done with this funding. It's great to have 100 billion, but what needs to be done and how to ensure that it benefits the most vulnerable. So with that, I'd like to pass the word to Karina for some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and hello, everybody. It's nice to see you and have such a good turnout. Greetings from The Hague. Can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, great. So I have about 5 minutes, and I would like to just focus on 3 messages, which on the surface may seem quite obvious to many of you in the room. This is a presentation not just about the quantity of finance that we heard so eloquently from Leticia and Sarah that needs to increase, but also I'd like to focus comments on the quality of finance. We don't just need more quantity, but we need greater quality. And that is because we need to ensure that the funding that is coming forward is reaching those most in need and benefiting them most. But what does greater quality mean? Well, we know that donor preferences have been shaped by historical, political, and trade ties, and that's where much of a bilateral aid goes. And we've also heard from the previous presenters where new sources of climate finance could come. But again, where should the funding go once it's there? How can we get this part right? Questions surrounding equity are central to this conversation. Leticia mentioned, should the finance, is the finance grant-based or loan-based? That's one key factor we should consider about the quality of the climate finance that is being put forward. Is the finance primarily for large-scale, low-risk projects where the difference to be made is greatest, which is often the preferred way of working for many donors, or is the finance that's reaching where the need is the greatest? So often those are places where it's more difficult to reach. Those are the poorest and most vulnerable, and where return on investment is not so quick and easy. We'd also like to see climate finance, we should consider, is it supporting short-term thinking, which can often lead to underallocation or, again, misallocation of funding? Or is this climate finance more patient, more long-term, more flexible, taking into account very different national and local realities? And I'll talk about some of those in a little bit more detail. So essentially, we need to think about, when we think about quality of finance, we need to think about how can we improve our targeting and monitoring of where finance is going, when it's reaching the most vulnerable, and on what basis. So I think we can all agree climate finance needs to reach the most vulnerable countries and communities. But interestingly, there's no correlation between the funding that's received for climate change and the degree of vulnerability of recipient countries and communities. That's because A, there's no global consensus on which countries are most vulnerable, and B, there are major gaps that exist in reporting on where the funding goes. And so if we understand that vulnerable is the poorest, they're the most marginalized people, those that are most exposed to hazards, I think we also should consider factors such as context in which these populations are living, fragile and conflict-affected contexts in particular, which also should be integral to defining vulnerability. However, according to some studies, 30% of the least ready countries to receive climate finance, of those 30 of those countries defined as least ready to receive climate finance, of those 30, 29 were considered fragile. And so clearly we're seeing that when there is climate finance that's being put forward, it's not actually reaching to those countries and communities that need it the most. And we need to really be thinking about how are we defining vulnerability and ensuring that the finance reaches the local level. One way we can do that, in addition to reaching communities, is focusing on how can we include communities in decisions about spending of finance that's going their way. Local actors, as we know, have sound understanding of the local context, the local realities, and the needs of the people who are most affected and impacted by climate change. And we know that truly locally owned participatory financing models, that's one way of expanding the donor's understanding of what these local contexts and realities are. So if we have greater understanding on behalf of the donors of what is needed on the ground, that can also lead to higher quality finance. However, in 2017, interestingly, this speaks a lot to how the finance is flowing and where it's going. Only 36.2% of the resources committed by the Adaptation Fund, for example, and only 6.2% of those resources committed by the Green Climate Fund went to national implementing entities. The rest of the finance remained at the global level. It was dispersed through international implementing entities such as multilateral development banks and UN agencies. So clearly there's a major disconnect, and that's affecting exactly how high quality this financing is, which also can be interpreted as how much it's really addressing the needs at the local level, and in particular of those poorest and most vulnerable. So recognizing this, I would say we need to really consider building the technical and managerial capacities of local actors to engage, in processes that shape decisions about their future. It's not just, again, about where the funding is going, but then how is it able to be received, who's at the decision-making table, and what are the capacities to really ensure that it flows where it needs to go. And I would posit that the principles of locally led adaptation action are an important tool for supporting this. And many of the climate funds have signed up and to be part and proponents and supporters of these principles. And so now it's also upon us to ensure that this is actually taking place and that we are seeing the local level lead the way in terms of solutions and informing the global response to the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karina. And that was a very, very important intervention. Building on this, of course, you touched on how is climate finance received and how does it flow where it needs to go. We will move on to our next speaker, Maureen Atieno. She is based in Kenya, works for Concern and the Flood Resilience Alliance, and she has been active in tracking climate finance, especially to see indeed whether it flows where it needs to go. So Maureen, over to you, and very curious to hear from you about the challenges and opportunities in this area.
Thank you so much. My name is Maureen Atieno Ndrangu. I work with Concern Worldwide. And for purposes of this conversation, I just wanted to present a little bit about our current situation in the countries that I'm representing. I'm the manager advocacy for flood resilience, representing South Sudan, Kenya, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. Our current situation, and I've realized a lot of what I'm going to talk about is building on what Karina has actually talked about. Our current situation, for instance, in the region, Kenya is currently experiencing, and actually largely the Horn of Africa is experiencing drought of about 3 years, resulting from failed 4 rain seasons. And what will happen in the context of Kenya is as soon as, and hopefully the drought ends, we are going to move into a flooding emergency situation. So for us, it's either way. When it's dry, it's extremely dry. And when it rains, then it's actually pours. South Sudan, in current situation, I think just a week ago, South Sudan is already experiencing another season of floods. Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi are currently recovering from the impact of Tropical Anna that happened in around January. And you could see, I traveled to Malawi and visited a village called Mangochi, in an area called Mangochi, and there was a village that was actually split into 2 by a river emerging from the impact of Tropical Anna. So these countries are experiencing loss and damage, something that, of course, is not gaining the traction that we hoped would for in this this year, now that we are hosting COP27 as Africa. Now, into climate financing challenges. And I'll give a critical example only specific to Kenya. If you look at the NDCs, generally around Africa, but specific for Kenya, 80% of climate finance that can be tracked is going towards mitigation. And that is on energy and infrastructure. Yet, if you see what Karina had just shared, we need a quality financing towards adaptation. And that is the interest, and actually looking at the losses and damages in these countries, I think that is where we need to be putting the resource for climate financing. That is, of course, for the little that can be tracked. There's also this argument that has been raised that the reason why we have a chunk of money being allocated towards mitigation is because mitigation actually benefits adaptation. I don't know how. Looking at this, the loss and damages these countries are experiencing, you can see in the picture. At the far left, this is Kenya. With the 2 dynamics. In the center, this is South Sudan. And down here, we have Malawi and what it has experienced around Tropical Anna. So, and then there's the other question, the other issue. Of course, in COP26, there was a lobby to have devolve GCF funds. And I'm feeding this into the conversation that what Karina has talked about, access to finance, climate finance to communities that are most vulnerable. This is still something that is, it has not happened yet, a year later, so to speak. And I think it's an issue. Perhaps it could be looked into to try and see how communities can access through community-based organization, and feeding into the conversation around localization of resources. And then the biggest challenge that we have on climate finance is tracking for African countries. We can only estimate. We can only estimate what is being allocated, be it from countries specific local-led financial allocation, or from what is flowing from the developing countries. There's a gap there. However, this is an opportunity for an investment, especially for programs that are like such as flood resilience, that is looking at adaptation and climate financing around that. We could work with different organizations to establish a climate financing tracking a group that could ensure that we can actually track who put what at how much and to do what exactly. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thanks a lot, Maureen, for this short intervention. And again, really important elements to highlight. I particularly like that you not only identified a challenge, but also an opportunity at the same time. Now we will be moving to Christina. Christina is working for PLAN in El Salvador, and she will be talking about some examples of what happens with climate finance at the local level, how to make an impact with the funding that is provided. So Christina, over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. Hello, everyone. Just let me know if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I will explain a little bit what happens when we have the climate finances. I will speak a little bit about El Salvador context to make you understand a little bit better how it's happening here. We just give the 0.3% of greenhouse emissions in Central America, in total Central America, but we are receiving, we are one of the most vulnerable areas in the whole country. For example, in El Salvador, we have more than almost 1 million people exposed to flooding, and we are just 6 million people in the country. We also have 4 climate zones in our small country, and we have the 85% of rainfall comes from thunderstorms, 15 from storms like that. We also have 4 million people exposed to susceptibility to landslide caused by flooding. So like you can see, we have a lot of complicated situation in the country. An example of what happened when we have a storm can be shown with this impact of storm Amanda in Cristobal. You can see the numbers. We have more than 53,000 people affected, 900 homes affected, also 128 damaged bridges, 14 people dead, and more than 1,000 families sheltered. Also, this situation caused the economy to fall between 6 and 80%. With this scenario, we need to work a lot on the communities. For example, we are implementing the measuring community resiliency of community to floods tools in a process of 4 steps. Number 1, design of the study. We select the community, we analyze what is going on, we decide the type of study, and we make the study designed with the RFMC. After that, we make the data collection. We do it through focus groups, interview with key informants, and also the review of secondary sources. When we finish the data collection, we start to rating and making the analysis of the results through a dashboard, through a qualification, through the generation of evidence in different ways. Also, we do some elaboration of action plans together with the communities. We work a lot with them. And this is one of the things that I want to highlight. The community is involved in all the process because they have to be, but also because they are the first people who respond when we had an impact of a disaster or an emergency. At the end, we make the intervention design. We find a way to make the best practices to building resilience. We also look for resilience building best practices as in the area. We make changes. We make different examples. We see different examples. We choose the best practices with this, and we also work with partnership with the government institution at local and municipality level. So with this, we are working not just with the community, the members of the community, but we are also working with local actors. And I want to show you a little bit one of the results. One of this line shows the result that we can find when we make these studies. This is a focus on 7 different topics. Like you can see, we see the assets and properties, how the houses are affected or can be affected by flooding. And you can see this qualification of the level of resilience in this line in the top. Also, we look for governance, we look for life and health, lifelines, livelihood, natural environment, social norms to understand how it's affecting the floodings to the communities and what the community can do to decrease the impacts of the flooding. So at the end, we make this big plan in with the community and the local actor, like I said before, and we start to do intervention, different intervention, depends of the things that we found in the studies. But this is not the only thing that we do. We also work on an influence actions also. For example, here we find one of the situations that we found is that the people need more information before the flooding. And also we realize that the Ministry of Environment needs to give the information to the community. So we design a communication strategy between the communities, the Ministry of Environment, and also we work with the Civil Protection Directorate to generate evidence, to community work with the tool, the FMC tool. We also design the community interventions, and we at the end make an agreement and joint work with the government institution to share this information. Now people know what will going on, what will happen when we have a storm. They understand, for example, how will be the impacts of the flooding or the storms in general. And also the Ministry of Environment can receive the information from the community to take decisions at the local level, medium level, or national level. So this helps a lot, and we can show all the things that we can do if we have the right finance for the communities. So back into you.
Thanks a lot, Christina. So we've heard from our three experts. Basically, we've heard that it's not just about the quantity, but also the quality of finance. Where should it go? We've heard about specific areas where it should go because of examples of the climate impacts that are already happening in certain countries in Africa, for example, losses and damages that are already widespread. Challenges related to climate finance in African countries, and the invitation to better track climate finance and flows and ensure that it goes where it should be going. And finally, we've heard from Christina an example of what can be done with climate finance to enhance flood resilience in El Salvador and influence policies and practices. So we've had a very big picture of climate finance today, and now we would like to pass it over to you for 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A with our experts. I'll pass it on now to Andrew to moderate the discussion.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Thanks for the sum up as well. That was great. I see that Mohammed would like to ask a question, so please go ahead if you'd like. Hello, Mohammed. Are you hearing me? It looks like you've got your hand up. No worries. Well, we'll come back to you if you still want to ask your question. In the meantime, I see Samuel also would like to ask a question.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And thanks for the wonderful presentations and also for the enlightenment in terms of finance, more of climate finance of loss and damage, and also how to tackle these issues when it comes to climate stress. I just wanted to ask, is there any possibility that these slides can be sent to emails, because the charts, the session for the chart isn't working from my end, so I don't know how I can be able to access most of these beautiful presentations. Thank you.
Yes.
I believe that it's being recorded, this session, so the recording should be available. Hello, sorry, someone say something there?
I mean for the slide, that I'm talking about.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. This is Muhammad.
I think someone's trying to speak, but it's a very, very bad line. If that's you, it might be better to just ask your question in the chat.
I think that's you, Mohammed. Do you want to type in the chat? We're having trouble hearing you.
Yes. Okay. You cannot hear me?
Oh, I can hear you very well now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. My question is, do you have
Yeah, I think we'll have to revert to the chat, I'm afraid. The line is not very good. Sorry, ma'am, but if you could just type your question, we'll make sure to get answered.
Right.
In the meantime, Shona would like to ask a question. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks so much to all the presenters. It's really interesting. I thought I would be slightly lost during all of this, but actually all the information is really accessible and great to hear from experiences at a country level as well. So well done to all the organisers. I just wanted to think about it. This is kind of something from the concern perspective, but I suppose something from the ZIFRA, the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance perspective on where do we think follow-up, maybe research might be useful. And I think a question kind of was asked around that, as in what we think maybe the next steps could be as to whether building from this current research might we be able to look at. I don't know whether there's something around the kind of quality aspect. I know that that's quite probably a tricky one, but if there is something there that there could be kind of research and policy done, and or at a regional level, and what we think the next step might be, and maybe some of the other people on the line might be able to think about how we can utilize it, because I think it's easier to to come up with the ideas and do the research, but then it's about kind of utilizing the current research and then maybe the next steps and what could follow on from that. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much for your question, Shona. Would any of the panelists in particular like to pick that one up or elaborate on what was being said there?
Maybe Sarah, you can, because it was your original research, and I may comment on the quality piece, unless you speak to that.
I think you can say it better. Thanks, Karina. And thank you very much for the question, Siona. I think there's three pieces to this, to my mind, and not all of them are research, to be honest. I think there's a piece about education and awareness within particularly the laggard countries. And by that, I mean the countries that are expected to pay climate finance in the Accords and those that have reached the point where we think that they should be. My experience in Australia and the US and Canada is that those countries believe that they're very generous on climate. They believe that they're leaders on climate action at home as well. And I think the evidence today really shows that that's not the case. And so there's a major role for informed commentary by the media and civil society to reach people who are interested in this, but are not perhaps getting robust information and presentations around this. I think that using the data that we have, not just from ODI work and ZEFRA work, but there's fantastic work by Oxfam, by Stockholm Environment Institute, by CARE in this space, which there's lots of sort of very memorable evidence on which countries can do better on what fronts. The second thing is that I think there's something you alluded to that I think is really important is better reporting formats. At the moment, the systems that we have for capturing data on climate finance provided and mobilized are incredibly poor. Letitia mentioned before that we just look at public finance because the data on private finance is calculated so differently. The public finance data we have, there's different ways of countries attributing development assistance to climate, and some countries, Japan, are extremely dodgy in how they do that. Other countries like France and again Japan count the face value of their loans instead of presenting the grant equivalent. And of course, they get most of their loans back with interest, even if it's not quite at commercial interest rates. So I think much more could be done to make sure that countries are sharing systematically in a standard way so that they can then be robustly compared and held to account. To give you a sense of how poorly that's done, the OECD every year, a couple of years late, provides a summary of progress towards the $100 billion goal. And they cannot release progress by country because they receive the data from countries, and it's so problematic that they have to substantially manipulate it to make it consistent. But of course, they can't then say that they have changed the data they receive from countries, and so they just can't share it so that people can't compare the two. And so there's a real problem on that side, not for all countries, but for some countries. And the third thing is that the 100 billion goal only lasts up until 2025. At that point, a new climate finance goal will be in place, which is currently being negotiated. Negotiations about it started off last year at COP26 and continue up to 2024. It's really important that that goal doesn't have the same failings of the current 100 billion goal. So the current one was basically a handshake deal between China, the US, and the EU to get us over the line. It's not clear if it's public, private, bilateral, multilateral, other sources, who provides it, who receives it. All of that was just left for the future to deal with. And we have an opportunity now to make that much more consistent, to say that adaptation finance should be grants or should be measured in grant equivalents, that we should have what's called a leverage ratio for mitigation finance, so that you are actually shaping private finance and kind of systematically steering economies as we should be on that side, to make it clearer who should be paying, to which countries should have preferential access because they're more vulnerable, and so on and so forth. That is already a very contentious debate. A lot of numbers being thrown around, a lot of claims being made on all sides. Getting that right and getting that fair will be really important going forward, and the more evidence and the more advocacy we have around that, it will be important.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. Shall I add to that? Oh, are we out of time? Okay.
We are just about out of time, I'm afraid. So I'll just hand it over to Barbara for some closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone also who submitted questions. Feel free to email them to us, and we can seek an answer for you after this webinar as well. So thank you all for participating in this webinar. Thanks to our fantastic speakers to elucidate all these different aspects on the question of fair shares in climate finance. We've discussed quite a wide range of climate finance issues from the kind of global to the more national level, and I hope it's been informative for you. I'd like to encourage you to read the Fair Shares report if you haven't done so already. And but yeah, we'll try to respond to your remaining questions by email. Don't hesitate to get in touch with ODI or the Zurich Alliance. And finally, we would like to ask you to leave feedback about this webinar in an evaluation form that Andrew just shared in the chat. And for now, enjoy the rest of your day or your evening. And thank you for participating in this webinar.